you so much for having us join you guys today at the GBO. I'll use the abbreviation. That's the new name, right? We don't say it out loud. I'm Van Breen. I'm the founder of a company called Qnary. We'll go through a little bit about what we do, but the reality is that I'm going to talk more about some findings. We do a big annual research study every year on the perception that executives have in terms of how their own online presence impacts themselves, as well as how it impacts the perceptions of other colleagues, so their reputation, how it impacts how they do business, etc. Not the businesses, not the brands, but the executives themselves, okay? So that's what we're going to be focusing on more today. We are, at this point, I guess we can say a global company, but in some ways we have very, very strong Spanish roots. I'm the founder of the company. I wrote the business plan in Cordoba, Spain. My wife is from Cordoba, and so there I was plugging away one summer when I kind of came up with the technology and the idea for the business. We have an office here in Spain based in Seville. Both Fran and Charlie are based there. We also have a team in London. Our largest team is obviously in New York, and then we have a team in Australia and a new Latin American team in Miami. So, which is where I live. I live in Miami. So, but we've been speaking for a while about what the GBO is up to, and we actually structured a relationship with you guys. And I've been over here for the last couple of days and wanted to come up and kind of share this. I think with the group the size it is today, to be honest, I think probably if you have any questions along the way, just stop me, shout out, or as we would say, call bullshit on something I say. Be very honest with me. I do speak Spanish, so if it's easier for me to present parts in Spanish or explain something in Spanish, I can always do that. But my English is much better than my Spanish, so I'll have to draw upon Fran or Charlie for that. But when I think about kind of talking about the research findings, I think it's kind of important to put it in the context of what's been happening to all of us. I would say that if we went back to March of 2020, all of us were essentially working like this in businesses. I think it was a while before I even met you guys. We were all kind of living virtually. Now we're moving back into kind of a real world. December was the first time that I met up with with the folks that live in New York, and it was great to see them because we hadn't been together in over a year. But it kind of continues to be this moment of transition for all of us. How we're going to all work, how we're all going to connect, and how business is going to function in some ways going forward. But certainly one of the things that we've noticed is that communications is definitely changing. There have been a lot of crises over the last couple of years with businesses failing, businesses growing, companies having to lay off thousands of people, companies actually hiring thousands of people. So there's a lot of dynamism in the marketplace. But there's almost this new expectation that executives, when they talk, are more open because they're available. They're much more open and available in this digital world. There's a demand for greater transparency. And also, I would say there's a demand that if you say something, you better do something. Certainly in the context of the US market, there's tremendous pressure on topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Whilst I'd say a decade ago, if you were a white male leader and you said we need to be hiring more diverse candidates, and you said that passionately, you'd get an applause. But today you'd be expected to make sure that the company has a very strict plan to make sure those types of diversity goals are hit. So actions are connected with words in a much more powerful way than ever before. And strangely enough, for someone, I've spent my career working in marketing, advertising, and communications. One of the things that I remember an early PR guru had once told me is that in a moment of crisis, you tell leaders to say nothing. You tell them to back away and be quiet. But something interesting has happened over the last couple of years, which is if you are silent as a leader at a moment of complexity or challenge, that silence is a message. That silence is perceived quite often as a form of compliance. And I know there was a famous chief marketing officer at Burger King, Fernando Machado, who I thought summed it up really well, where he said, in the world of today, if you say something, you will probably get criticized. And if you don't say anything, you will probably get criticized. So whether you want to speak up or reserve the right to remain silent, do so out of conviction and not due to fear of criticism. The thought before was, as a leader, you didn't want to put yourself in the line of fire, so to speak. But today, you're almost expected to have some type of a dialogue. And so, this is kind of the backdrop we find ourselves when we approach our research study. We work with Emerson College in Boston and Blanquerna, if you're familiar with Blanquerna, in Barcelona. It's one of the communications schools here in Spain, to create a study. This will be our 5th year. The 4th year study in 2020 was it was our largest study at that time. Some of the big findings were that over 38% viewed a social media professional presence to be more important during the COVID-19 pandemic than ever before. So there had been an increase in the demand and importance of the area. 90% of business professionals were perusing or posting on LinkedIn, not like once a month, but every week. So tremendous amount of activity on some of these channels. 33% of business professionals followed other executives on YouTube. That last one was an interesting finding for us in 2020 because up till 2020, the video platforms like YouTube and Instagram and others had been less important from a professional perspective. It had been thought of, those were kind of like, if you wanted to be a celebrity or an influencer or somebody like that, those were important, but from a professional standpoint, they weren't that valuable. But in 2020, we found that there was actually this increase in interest in social media, or in multimedia. Fast forward to the 2021 study, which is what we completed in December of this year, so last month. It was our largest study ever, so it's a global study. We had over 1,800 respondents. We had over people responding from over 35 countries. You'll see that the majority of people were senior executives, which kind of reflects the nature of the audience that we're trying to reach, primarily executives, C-suite owners, definitely above the level of manager. A relatively fair split between men and women in terms of senior executives, so kind of a balance. And then the respondents were from quite a variety of business verticals, from real estate to finance to retail, etc. And a nice age range, age split, really kind of capturing those people in those important age, working moments in life. And I think this will be important when we get to some of the results, because I think there's a bit of a generational shift that's happening. And so it's a very interesting moment for us in the space. If I were to look at 3 key insights that we see from this year's study in comparison to last year's study, LinkedIn still is probably the most important professional channel online for professionals, for executives. Absolutely, it has almost 100% saturation at this point. I mean, literally almost any person who would be an executive, a CEO, is on LinkedIn at this point. That being said, the engagement levels, the interaction levels that we saw have actually dropped significantly on LinkedIn. And what we're seeing is that people are actually spending a lot more time on channels like Instagram and YouTube to look up other executives to find information. And that's really kind of related to that generational point. As millennials reach the age of, I would say, leadership in companies, I believe that what they're doing is they're either using the channels that they grew up with and staying with that, or they're actually demanding more of a multimedia shift to kind of support that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We see a very high positive perception of executives who are active and post on social media platforms. In the past, when we started this study 5 years ago, I would say that it was pretty split. It depended on really the region, on whether people would think an executive with a strong footprint versus not was a good thing. Let me get some water. Today, I would say it's almost expected. I mean, very, very high perception of executives that had active presence online. And thirdly, COVID was kind of a floodgate in terms of people having active presence online. I think we're spending, you'll see the numbers, but the number of hours that people are spending on all these platforms has increased dramatically. And so perhaps that will dissipate a bit as we start to gather together again. But at the same time, perhaps it won't dissipate completely, because we have actually had enough time to develop new rituals, new habits of how to work. And we would say that that's probably related to the new way of working. If we look at the key channels for executives, it's probably no surprise, but as I said, LinkedIn posts are probably one of the key formats that executives like to share information on, followed by things like tweets. Other areas, though, that have been interestingly important are these ones that I just mentioned before. Instagram would have been in 2020 and in 2019, maybe 10%. So this has been like a dramatic shift that these have been moving up so aggressively. We know them as popular channels, but they were popular from a social perspective. It's interesting to see them now become more popular from a professional business perspective. When we look at the social media platforms and what people use them for, it's interesting to see some of the changes here. So, this is a hard one to see, but if you look at LinkedIn here, I follow other business professionals on this platform. This was in 2020, 67% of the people said yes. In 2021, that had dropped down below 50%. I thought that's a dramatic shift. For such a large channel, that type of a shift was something that was very notable for us. Trying to understand it completely, because LinkedIn, it still hasn't removed as an important channel. It's just, I would say, it's perhaps been joined by the increase of others. And we see them down here, like YouTube going from 33% to 40%. So those are kind of some of the shifts that we're talking about in the marketplace. We talked about how people are perceived who share. Sometimes we probably all have the same human reaction, which is we might know somebody who shares a lot of information. You're just like, fucking John, like he's always sharing posts. What is that bullshit? Like, that's not a job, right? However,
it's not a job.
However, the reality is that what we're seeing is perhaps because more people are sharing and people that are perhaps more credible in other areas of business are sharing, it's becoming more expected, and it's more of a positive perception. I would have said that, as I said, when we started the study, this was more around like the 50% range. Now we're kind of like hovering around the 70% range of people seeing having an active voice online as a positive thing. So these are pretty high numbers. Yeah.
On LinkedIn, I subscribe to too many things, and every morning there's like 20 things, and my immediate reaction is delete, 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 delete. Do you study? I barely read a sentence. Because I'm thinking,
Right.
yeah, that group, yeah, delete. I don't even bother. Do you study how many people actually just kind of waste their breath posting when people say they're positive versus people actually say like, no, I really, really everything this person says, or do they just kind of say, oh yeah, that's great that they're sharing, but do they really care?
It's a really good question. I mean, one of the shifts that when we started, we used to very much focus on looking at the posts and the general impressions that post would receive, right? The number of eyeballs that actually would see it. Now we look much more closely at the engagement level that those posts actually get, and engagement is a much more important measure. That's actually people taking the time to connect, make a post, make a comment, somehow interact with that post. And certainly you'll see some people that will post and will get no comments on anything that those people post, and that's pretty much a waste of time. But if you're able to kind of cultivate that engagement, it means that you're speaking to a niche audience usually that is engaged on the same things you are. And that's really kind of what we think thought leadership is. Thought leadership's not, at Qnary, we don't make celebrities, right? If you want to become Kim Kardashian, I can give you a number of a guy to call in Hollywood, right? But what we're aimed at doing is trying to create people that are credible in the business space that they focus on, and getting that kind of connection with others. So I totally know what you're talking about. There's probably a lot of posts you're like, no, 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 no. And the other thing is the nature of those posts. So at times those posts can be perhaps overly salesy, right? Maybe overly commercial in nature, and those are annoying, right? Or perhaps they're overly I'm looking for the word, but you're praising yourself too much, right? Those are annoying as well. Those are things that you learn in terms of tone and structure and how you kind of approach those types of things. But I would say anybody who's sending out commercial messages en masse is going to fail, right? Nobody wants that. Even if you're selling, I would say not to push out commercial messages. Yeah. You should be offering some form of a value in that sale. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your. Yeah, but I know I understand your frustration with that one. But one of the things that we look at very closely is would following a business or brand leader influence you? And one of the questions we often get is, well, so I follow, so somebody follows me as a CEO, does that impact business in any way? And we see that, in fact, actually, people are much more likely to purchase from brands when they follow the company as well as the executive leadership of that company. So there is some type of a correlation between that connection. We believe that kind of the relationship between brands and executives has completely changed. In the past, we would have said that if you were working for a successful business, you could kind of hide behind your brand. You could kind of promote your brand and kind of be almost anonymous behind it. Nowadays, the executive and the brand sit side by side. They're both kind of flag carriers for the ultimate kind of core purpose of the company. And so those two things have to be kind of thought about in tandem now, which is a slightly different kind of way of thinking about it. One of the topics that comes up a lot now, especially in a world with so much fake news and fake information, is trust. You guys may be familiar with Edelman. Edelman does a big report called the Trust Barometer every year. I think we've been doing it for several decades now. Their big announcement of the most recent report was that there's almost no trust in NGOs, in governmental organizations at this level, at this stage. We have no trust for those types of things. We have very little trust for the media. very little trust for public figures altogether. And in Edelman's report, they say, in fact, actually the most trust sits with brands today and companies. What we would argue is, in fact, actually, that may be the case to where they took their study, but we would take it to the next level, which is, in fact, our results show that executives are much more likely to trust statements from an executive's social media account rather than the organization or the brand's account. That's up from 39% in 2020 to over 50% in 2021. So, I mean, a significant growth in people literally looking at a subsector of executives to find trustworthy information. We're all looking for stuff that we can trust, but I think it's actually, I mean, I would not disagree with what Edelman is saying, but I think they perhaps actually just didn't push their thinking far enough. It's actually a subset of executives that are trusted. How has your perception of using social media for professional reputation changed with COVID? As I mentioned before, we're seeing social media being thought of as being important to build a professional reputation, being more important. Basically, around 50% of executives said that they thought it was more important compared to about 40% the year before. And in terms of the day-to-day use, we're seeing 56% of people saying that they're using social media platforms now more this year than last year. So still, whilst we all can read the media and hate on Facebook, etc., the reality is that people are spending more and more time on these channels as part of this kind of like hybrid work world that we live in. So, when we think of kind of executive presence, we would say at Qnary, we see it having tremendous benefits for executives across several different areas. Certainly, one of the areas is being perceived as a thought leader has some level of professional value amongst their peers, but also can actually increase the value of what that person does or what that person's business does amongst their peers. Credibility, we find that it actually plays a big role in an area that's very important today, which is recruitment. There's a tremendous battle that we all hear about, this battle for talent, as everyone's quitting and trying to find meaning and purpose, finding a way to actually communicate and connect. A lot of executives seem to have some form of myopia when it comes to understanding that if an employee is looking for a job, they're actually going to look at the executive's presence online as well, because that's how they really understand what the company is, not just looking at the brand pages. We see it obviously playing a role in helping personal brand development and then ultimately, obviously, sales. When we talk to companies and talk to people, just generally, we would see there being kind of three areas that we would advise all executives to think about when they're thinking about their own social media and executive presence. The first area would be, we would advise them to try to own social. And what we mean by that is there will be multiple platforms out there, probably platforms that you don't ever want to use, but if you can own your name, own your page, that's very important. I'm not saying that you need to be posting there, but what we want is to make sure you have ownership of that. Because at a moment of crisis or perhaps development, you might want to have control of that. And certainly it will give you more control of your search results, your Google search results, which is very important. Sharing content is very important, probably to the point that you raised before. Not only sharing content, but sharing content that garners engagement in some form or fashion is very important, and then controlling search. When I started the business, Google was the #1 place where a person would go to look up another person. They would type in a name and they would do a Google search. It's now the second most important channel behind LinkedIn. People actually will go to LinkedIn first when they're looking up another person, and a lot of that is really based on the mobile phone. as we have apps, people will just pull up LinkedIn, boom, and pull somebody's name in. However, Google is still a close number 2. And so it's still a very important channel. And so we want to make sure that actually executives have, oh, you want to take a picture of that? You can, we're going to give this to you, so, yeah. I'll let you just, yeah. The second thing that I would highlight, and I know that Brian and Charlie would talk about this a lot with clients, is that whilst we would want you to post, we don't really want executives to post about everything. The problem with executives, including myself, I'm very guilty of this, is that we think we know too much, and we talk about too many topics. And the problem with that is you're never going to break through in a digital world if you talk about a million different things. You really need to try to own specific topics that you will become a true thought leader in and that are very relevant to you. And so we generally tell our clients to have 3 content pillars at most that they're focusing their whole platform on and all their messaging on. That could be something related to the business, perhaps a shared kind of like purpose and mission that you have with the business, an area that you're focused on professionally, and maybe a personal interest of some sort, right? But really kind of keeping that tight. Not talking about, unless you work at Real Madrid, probably not talking always about that, at least not on your professional channels, right? Hello, Madrid. There are certain channels that we want to make sure that you focus your efforts on, for sure. We would want to make sure you have a strong footprint on LinkedIn. Twitter remains still a very important channel for a variety of reasons, mostly technologically, which is that most of the technologies that are used to track trends really are fed by Twitter data. And so if you look at like banking systems, media systems that are used by journalists, event organizers, they all have data systems that are tracking people on what they're doing on Twitter. So having a presence on Twitter, it matters for you just to be on that radar. And so whilst I certainly hate the kind of, you talk about the pressure on LinkedIn, on Twitter it's 10 times worse, I don't want to get in a Twitter war with anybody, but I do know that it's important to have a professional presence on Twitter. And then as you said...
Is it though? Because it's so LinkedIn is, execs, C-suite, etc. Everyone wants to see that. And when you're talking, let's say to an adult, right? Mm-hmm. Posting on LinkedIn is a way to do it. Twitter seems to me just like shouting in a void, and sometimes stuff hits you back, and sometimes it doesn't. But there's no conversation.
Yeah.
On Twitter. There's no content. Yeah. There's no quality where you can actually. 180 characters. Correct. You can't come up with a structured argument. There's no, you just rants.
From your personal usage perspective, you're spot on. However, open up a copy of El País tomorrow and look at what media channels get used as supporting documentation to an article that they're writing. And they're almost always tweets. And the reason why is that the technology that journalists use to track what's happening is Twitter. It's because Twitter, of all the platforms, is the most open to developers like us, actually, as well. Like when we started out, the first data that we actually were able to utilize and to analyze and to put into our own machine learning system was Twitter. So investment banks, all the top banks will have very sophisticated ways of looking at ETFs and cryptocurrencies, and they're all using Twitter data. So it's less about using it personally and more about how that is filtered through systems. Yeah, it's more of a technical thing. YouTube has become more important because we've noticed that there's this increasing kind of voyeuristic quality that before you meet somebody or after you meet somebody, you go on and you try to see if there's a video of that person. And it's kind of a credibility builder. It's kind of a way to really understand them. Perhaps in the past you could just have kind of a CV or a profile of somewhere, but now having some type of multimedia seems to be quite important. So not a ton, but something that really allows people to get a sense of who that person is. I would say that, we produce those, and I would say they get the most engagement by far and away. The numbers on some of those videos are just insane. You realize that we are humans and we like to look at one another and check each other out before you meet somebody, etc. I'm going to skip through that, but I mean, we see that there's strategic approaches to how you would handle content. As we highlighted, one of the big things would be to perhaps not create a ton of content, but to create content that kind of appeals to specific audiences. But if you guys were to go out today and think about the stuff that we've been going through today, I would kind of look at your current online presence as it exists. I would probably look at some of the topics that you really care about, that you would want to build a profile around. Be honest with yourself. Perhaps there's fewer things. I would say that probably the clients that break through the most that we have actually probably even focus on less than 3. Probably, we have probably one of our most famous clients does one topic every year, and then he'll switch it, and he's been able to rotate that. Make sure that you procure and optimize channels like LinkedIn and Twitter. Make sure that you build other channels like Medium. Medium's probably not a channel that you're familiar with. It's kind of a longer form blogging platform. It has, I would say, probably a more powerful footprint in the kind of emerging media and technology space and kind of the Silicon Valley crowd. But it has had, it gets a lot of importance and authority on channels like Google. And so we actually would say Medium would be a channel that you want to make sure you have. Review and manage your privacy settings. We all make this mistake, but one of the things that perhaps we all don't realize is most of your stuff that you think is private is probably not. So you need to be much more discreet about some of those things and much more disciplined in how you structure that. We would say that sharing content is important. We certainly would never recommend someone share content across many channels. We usually say select 1 or 2 channels that you really are going to own as being like the place where you would develop your voice. Most likely those would be things like LinkedIn. If you were more video focused, this year I would say, if I'm going to use last month as a focus, it's incredible how many people are using our video services, which is mostly Instagram, and so video is becoming a much ultimate resource going forward. Engage and follow influencers, so connect with others. And ultimately, I'm going to skip to the last, which is engage with others. Like, it's not just about you getting stuff out there, but share the love. Engage with others, find out what they're doing, and try to connect with an audience. So, it's interesting when we started. When I started the company, I really kind of started it with a purpose to try to give people a voice. There's so much power for digital companies to kind of push information at us, and yet there's so much expertise that so many people have. And so it's become so important to make sure that you share that, become part of that global conversation. And in this new hybrid digital world that we now live in, post-COVID or maybe mid-COVID, it's even more important than before. So that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, Dan, what do you think about Clubhouse as a platform for professional use?
I think Clubhouse is a wonderful case study, a COVID case study. So I think Clubhouse, their numbers, I think it's perceived to be the fastest growing platform ever. and yet it's also the fastest decreasing platform ever. So it disappeared as fast as it grew. There was really almost no stickiness to that platform, and the technical thesis behind it was, whilst our time as a human had been maxed out in terms of what we could focus on visually, we still had this ambient area of media that we could consume through something like Clubhouse. But what I think Clubhouse didn't realize is the stickiness of podcasts. The podcast business is massive. I think there's over 2.5 million professional podcasts at this point. Spotify has the vast majority of that market already. So I'm not I think Clubhouse kind of was like a COVID experience, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Good.
Let's not use that.
Sorry, say that?
Let's not use that.
No.
Is that okay? Yeah.
And what about the metaverse? Do you think it is going to change anything?
Just in time. Just in time. Well done.
Or is it going to be the same thing but in a different kind of universe?
You know, the metaverse is it's a lovely thing to make fun about, to have a good laugh about, because it seems so ridiculous, right? You watch those videos that Mark Zuckerberg posts, and they seem childish in some way. And yet, if you were to sit down with our team of developers, they're obsessed with Web 3.0, and they're obsessed with what blockchain capabilities can do in terms of identity management. And so I think that when you hear the hype and you see a visualization of a room of floating figures, perhaps kind of pull away from that for a second and think about the things that are changing business completely. And that is blockchain, that is machine learning, and we're going to see those elements that are going to fuse themselves into everything that we're all doing, for sure, for sure. I don't think next year we're going to be holding our meetings in an augmented reality room. I don't see how that's more efficient at this stage. However, there does seem to be kind of a new momentum, you know, in to play around with those things. We'll see how it all develops. I feel like, you know, anybody who lived through the creation of Second Life and some of these earlier platforms can kind of laugh at some of these things now. I'm more interested in what's kind of behind that visual, you know, which is if I'm really truly able to identify you in that metaverse, that it's really you, that's really kind of interesting. That then starts to become a true digital representation of you, and that is something that we're thinking about. Yeah.
Yesterday there was Sifted came up with a 1-hour chat on the metaverse, and I logged into that.
Yeah.
And after 20 minutes I thought, what the fuck is this? Who cares? You know, hang up and do something real.
Yeah.
Right? And because you're like, when you see, I came up with the guy from some venture, I'm like, what benefit can that possibly add? For video games, for, you know, that's really good, like,
Yeah.
real life application. So you're right, I mean, to me, I completely agree, you know, blockchain, augmented reality, but that specifically, the metaverse, I still have to struggle to figure out, like,
my personal thought on this stuff is, in some ways, I feel like I've been living in the metaverse for the last 2 years, and I haven't really loved it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if the idea of cocooning in my house and being on Zoom calls all day, and really the only way you know me is through a video screen, isn't that the metaverse?
Yeah.
That's kind of a close kind of proximity to what we're talking about. I think that, you know, there's a youth movement to perhaps make games more exciting, richer graphics, etc. That's always going to happen. And yes, that could be kind of part of the metaverse. I do think, though, this underlying kind of ability of creating almost a virtual self that exists in some digital world is where these folks are pushing. And the only way that will work is if you're able to kind of tether that back to reality in some form or fashion, right? Through through your bank accounts, through who you are, really. And that's where this kind of can start to get really interesting, because one of the biggest problems with social platforms to date has been that, in fact, actually, there isn't as strong of a connection between a Facebook page and a real person. There's a lot of fake Facebook pages, right?
Yeah.
So this would be, there's a lot of interesting stuff, and there are people like Draper. I think there's some of the bigger venture capitalists are betting heavily in it. So whether will it fail? I don't know. I don't think it will fail. I think it will be slower to develop, for sure. It's not. We're not going to be. Yeah, this is a much more preferable way to see you guys today, right? But I'm sure there'll be some conferences that we go to, and there'll be some gimmicks that someone will want to do. The question is whether, when I thought about it, my feeling is it more efficient? Is it fun? And for me, it wasn't efficient. Like, to hold a meeting in an augmented reality or in a virtual space is a fucking nightmare, right? Because there's huge technical limitations that we all have, right? If we're not on all incredible high bandwidth connections, you might be shaking in and out, you might not be able, you might be frozen, we might only get to hear Charlie, right? So it's not necessarily as equitable or as balanced of an experience. However, I would tell you to watch the space closely. I would tell you to look at probably the companies that you can track that are coming out with very targeted machine learning solutions, very targeted blockchain solutions, and see what they're doing, because those are going to be the gateways that go into that world. And even crypto is, part of that. So, yeah.
I actually spoke to somebody who he was creating he would 3D render conference centers from around the world, and then you could hold the events within that conference center, and then you as your avatar goes, and then like the aspect that they want to scale it to as many people as possible, and you can go, you see the 3D rendering of the conference center, and then they set up like puestos, like posts with the businesses. And he was giving me a presentation. He's like, oh, do you want to talk about this? Do you want to see this person speak? And you go in, and so there was that aspect of it, and then there was the aspect of how much data they get on the people that go, and how much and then if you say, okay, if me as a person going into this virtual space, and I let them say, yes, please contact me, and they get all my data and all that, and then they have that avenue to scale this to as many people, but that's the other aspect.
In every aspect of your life. Right?
Exactly, yeah. And they get the data just instantaneously, and or if you like a Tony Robbins speech, if they try to scale that virtually, and those types of possibilities that they're looking to entertain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, if you ever have the opportunity, or if you already own it, I mean, definitely try some of these things. Use Oculus, see what you think. I find it to be a less than enjoyable experience, but clearly Mark Zuckerberg disagrees with me. Yeah. I think from our perspective, though, the thing that we're most focused on is identity, and trying to understand how identity will pass from the real world to the virtual world, and how does that happen in a way? How do you become identifiable in both worlds in a meaningful way, in a real way? So,
And what does it mean?
and what it means, right? Because Second Life basically was an escapism, right? I don't know if you guys remember Second Life, but Second Life essentially became folks that want to go have like crazy sex time, right, with virtual characters, right? So it was more of a way not to be yourself, right, or to be your personal self, maybe to be more yourself, right? And so the only way it really creates more value is if you're able to make that identity piece function properly. And it's certainly not going to be what you see from Zuckerberg today. I would say the reason why what he's doing is interesting is that he has the third most capitalized company in the world, and he's betting everything. I mean, it's from a business case study, it's quite an incredible feat to take a company that has 68,000 employees and shift them from one objective to a completely different area.
Yeah.
If he succeeds, that would be a first. I've never heard someone succeeding in doing that.
Okay, Don, so maybe you want to address the audience in YouTube and remind them that they have access to an executive analysis of their online presence for free, just for being members of GBO.
Yes, absolutely. Well, certainly one of the things that we would love to do is, and you can speak to Fran and Charlie about this, but set up time where we have a team of analysts that will do an evaluation of your current online presence today, and provide kind of recommendations, tips, and tricks of what you could be thinking about going forward. So we've done a deal with GBO to offer you guys that, and it's a lot of fun. It's always it's also often kind of surprising for people to see that stuff, but it's a great place to start the discussion of some of the things that we've been looking at today.
Thank you guys for sharing this report with us and for being here with us today.
It's been great to be here. Cheers.
Great. Thank you.